Hello everyone and welcome to Making Public Histories, Populism, Democracy and Covid-19. My name's Alicia Soretto and I am the Executive Officer of the History Council of Victoria. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and honour their connections to land, sea, community and history. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Boonwurrung people, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present. We also acknowledge that yesterday was National Sorry Day, and we recognise the history and continued effect of the forced removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from their families, communities and culture. Making Public Histories is a seminar series offered jointly by the Monash University History Program, the History Council of Victoria and the Old Treasury Building. Each event aims to explore issues and approaches in making public histories. And the seminars are open to anyone interested in the creation and impact of history in contemporary society. And I'm very pleased that you've all joined us this evening, especially to those Victorians grappling with the news of a 7-day lockdown. Tonight, I'm joined by Al Thompson and Susie Prochke from Monash University, who will support us in the Q&As, and to Margie Anderson, who is representing the Old Treasury Building, who will support us behind the scene. Now, we are joined by 3 speakers who you can see on your screen, Peter McPhee, Jon Piccini and Imogen Saunders, and they'll be reflecting on the nature of populism and democracy and bringing our current day of COVID-19 into the conversation. I'll show you our guide to Making Public Histories seminars. I know that so many of you will be very familiar with Zoom over the last year, but we do like to give you a bit of a rundown. Each of our speakers will talk for about 12 to 15 minutes, and then it will be followed by a Q&A of about 5 minutes. And then at the end, we'll bring all our speakers on screen for a Q&A discussion facilitated by Susie Prochke. So if you have any questions of the speakers, if you use the Q&A button down on the bottom of your screen to ask those at any time during our speakers' presentations. And if you'd like to, you can be anonymous if you wish, as we will be recording this session tonight, and it will go on our YouTube channel next week. We use the chat if you need to for any sort of thank yous or comments, or if you have any technical challenges that you need support for. So thanks once again, and without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker. So Jon and Imogen will close their videos for now whilst Peter speaks. So beginning, thank you all again for joining us to reflect on this history of populism and democracy. The idea for this session was prompted by the bicentenary of Napoleon Bonaparte's death, and with Peter's expertise in French history, we couldn't say no. And we thought it was also an opportune time to explore Australia's populist past and to consider the impact of COVID-19 on current day politics and law. Peter McPhee is the chair of the History Council of Victoria and Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Melbourne. He is a historian of revolutionary France and the biographer of Maximilien Robespierre. Welcome, Peter.
All set to go. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, died 200 years ago this month in exile on the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. In my presentation today, I want to do 2 things. First of all, to say something about this brilliant, controversial man, and also to outline why he may be described as the first modern populist leader. He has much to tell us about the present. A son of the French Revolution, Napoleon embedded in French society the revolution's core goals of civil equality, religious pluralism, a social hierarchy based on merit and achievement, and a rural society based on private property rather than feudal obligations. But Napoleon's brilliance, military genius, and vision was qualified by his cynicism, cruelty, and vanity. A child of the Enlightenment in his passion for rational knowledge and disdain for unearned privilege, the emperor was also comfortable with flattery, nepotism, and pomp, captured in this portrait of him by Ingres. Although a child of the French Revolution, Napoleon also destroyed it. In November 1799, the French Parliament was driven out of its chamber by troops commanded by the general. He immediately turned to propaganda to justify what he'd done. In this early image, showing himself pulling France back from the abyss of anarchy into which the demons of dissent are trying to drag it, pulling France back towards a republic of prosperity and unity. After the coup d'etat, the regime held a plebiscite to elicit public support, but systematically falsified the results by doubling the yes votes to over 3 million and lowering the no votes to just 1,500. The most famous work of propaganda by the contemporary artist Jacques-Louis David also helped with Napoleon's propaganda effort, depicting the emperor on horseback, a white charger crossing the Alps in 1800, when we know in fact that Napoleon had crossed the Alps on the back of a sure-footed donkey. Napoleon's longing for some sort of historical legacy linking him to the great days of the past is evident in the way that David has painted on the rocks in the foreground, not only Napoleon's name, but also that of Hannibal, the great Carthaginian general who crossed the Alps with elephants 2,000 years earlier. In his plebiscites, Napoleon preferred to intimidate opponents into abstaining, using dubiously high votes to approve actions that he had already taken. So in 1804, in the plebiscite to approve him becoming emperor for life, of the 47% who voted, 99.93% voted yes. But David also captured another side of his public persona in another propaganda painting, this time of Napoleon the statesman, with his civil code or Napoleonic code on the desk behind him, an extraordinary document in which Napoleon synthesized what he felt were the durable achievements of the French Revolution in terms of its legislation and constitutions. And here Napoleon is depicted working through the night with the clock in the background at 4:15 and the candle in the background almost burnt down to the wick. Another form of propaganda, this time of the statesman, the tireless friend of the French people and of the principles of the French Revolution. The bicentenary of Napoleon's death is a fertile moment to reflect on the history of modern populism. For here was the archetypal great man on horseback who inspired astonishing personal devotion, someone who justified his power as the popular will and yet cynically manipulated that will when necessary. He did not hesitate to close down critical newspapers or to imprison political opponents. Napoleon's obsession with creating a European order under French hegemony, one which at its greatest extent stretched from the Atlantic all the way to Russia, his obsession with a Napoleonic empire came at the expense of perhaps 900,000 of his own people's lives, culminating in the fatal invasion of Russia in 1812. The bodies are still being exhumed in the Baltic states. His wars caused the deaths of a greater number of other Europeans who fought him or who were drafted into his armies. Some estimates put the deaths as high as 4 million. As a populist claiming to be the personification of the people's will, Napoleon had a need for historical legacy and legitimacy, rather like Donald Trump with his appeals to the legacy of President Andrew Jackson. In the National Library of Australia is this extraordinary tablecloth, 20 metres long, which came from Napoleon's palace at Fontainebleau. And you can see underneath the letter N, 3 what appear to be bees. In fact, they're cicadas, and they reflect Napoleon's need to fabricate a genealogy of greatness. Early in the 17th century, the tomb of Childeric, the founder of the Merovingian dynasty in the 5th century, the tomb had been opened in northern France and had been found to contain a number of golden cicadas. And what Napoleon was doing here with this symbolism is trying to construct a genealogy linking himself back to the oldest dynasty in French history. In the decades after Napoleon's imprisonment and death in 1821, he was reified into an almost supernatural celebrity through the creation of a durable, unusually potent myth that became a full-blown cult, and not just in France. From the moment of his capture in 1815, there was a polarity of English responses, from popular fascination with the world's greatest celebrity to demands for bloody retribution in the Tory press. In the decades after his capture and death, there were hundreds and thousands of cheap images and mementos of Napoleon produced and sold in Britain. Prints such as these, or cheap statuettes that were sold to people in Britain. The solution of the British government was exile and imprisonment on the distant, hot, wet and windy South Atlantic island of St. Helena. Napoleon's protracted, excruciating death in May 1821, because of either a gastric hemorrhage or stomach cancer, was to become another element of the Napoleonic legend. The alleged poisoning, more proof of Albion's perfidy. The power of Napoleon's legend was also a deliberate creation by the emperor and of his acolytes during the 6 remaining years of his life. This was a reworking of his memory into that of an idealized savior, the invincible general, protector of his people, and defender of democracy until undone by betrayal and conspiracy. One popular woodblock print in 1835 depicted Napoleon's apotheosis, welcomed into the heavens by Alexander the Great, Caesar, George Washington, and Frederick the Great. Widespread popular suspicion in France about Napoleon's early death, aged just 51, escalated into certainty that he would reappear one day. The attempt by his successor, King Louis Philippe, in 1840, to profit from Bonapartist memories by bringing back Napoleon's ashes from St. Helena to Paris, backfired badly. Instead, there was a rush of paintings and caricatures imagining the emperor's reconstruction, such as this extraordinary painting by Vernet in 1840 depicting Napoleon emerging from his tomb. The image of Napoleon as a young man, which I used on the title page of today's presentation, is in fact produced at much the same time in 1846, heavily stylized. The cultivation of the Napoleonic legend was further enhanced by his nephew, Louis Napoleon, whose seizure of power 30 years later with the army in December 1851, and then proclamation of the Second Empire in 1852, strengthened this myth of Bonapartism as representing the deepest longings of the French people. The real France, la France profonde. Like his uncle, Louis Napoleon claimed to be the protector of democracy even as he seized power with the army. His 1851 and 1852 plebiscites, like his uncle's, intimidated opponents into abstaining and falsified results. Even today, there remains an obsession with Napoleon and his remains. Auctions of Napoleonic memorabilia and militaria are still very popular, and people pay extraordinary amounts of money for artifacts from the Napoleonic Wars. It's still possible in France today to purchase luxury sets of cutlery, such as this one with Napoleon's cicadas or bees on the handles. The constructed memory of Napoleon has cast a long shadow of the strong man who could slice through the verbiage of self-seeking politicians, if needs be with the army, to satisfy the people's needs. This is Lionel Jospin, Socialist Party Prime Minister of France from 1997 to 2002, and twice a presidential candidate in France. In 2014, Jospin published a powerful polemic, Le Mal Napoléonien, or the Napoleonic sickness or curse, in which Jospin identified this authoritarian shadow as an ongoing blight on French democracy. The shadow endures. Just last month, on the 60th anniversary of a failed army coup in 1961 against General de Gaulle at the height of the Algerian War of Independence, 1,000 serving French soldiers, led by 20 retired generals, warned of a looming civil war in France because of alleged Islamic separatism and left-wing anti-racism. They assured the French people that they were at the ready. Coinciding as it did with the bicentenary of Napoleon's death, this military gesture conjured up Jospin's nightmare. Of course, it's not an exclusively French nightmare. Napoleon reminds us of the core characteristics of populism that remain with us today. And I think there are four key ones. The claim that in times of crisis, the crisis itself may be overcome by a powerful leader, able to appeal to a popular endorsement over the heads of elected politicians. And these powerful leaders, of course, are almost always male. The appeal to armed force and to sweeping, simple solutions. The willingness to manipulate news, to manipulate symbolism, and even evidence, such as election results. And finally, the targeting or even silencing of opponents. In these ways, it seems to me that Napoleon was a template for today's populist politicians, except that he combined these characteristics with great brilliance and commitment to the core values of the French Revolution. So, was Napoleon the first modern populist politician? I think he was. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks for all of those fabulous images. And I'm going to invite Al Thompson, Professor of History at Monash, who will manage the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Alicia, and thank you, Peter. That was wonderful. Just a reminder to all the participants, please use the Q&A if you've got any questions, and then I'll direct them to Peter. So here's one question. Napoleon's obsession with the trappings of monarchy and with the privileges of monarchy, did that presage the modern emergence of monarchs as populists?
I think that's a terrific question. And in fact, the fact that Napoleon's celebrity status after his imprisonment in 1815, his celebrity status came to be greater than that of Queen Victoria herself, I think taught the supporters of Queen Victoria an extraordinary lesson. I mean, the proliferation of hundreds of thousands of Napoleonic artifacts, prints, statuettes, and so on, was not lost on supporters of the English monarchy when it reached a fairly low point in the 19th century, and there was a deliberate creation of tradition to follow the wonderful book that Eric Hobsbawm edited about the invention of tradition in the 19th century. I think Napoleon was the first populist politician and monarch in the sense that he deliberately cultivated that dimension of his rule, and particularly in the years after his arrest and imprisonment before he died.
Thanks, Peter. I think that sort of probably answers the second question, which you talked about Napoleon as a template, or perhaps the first template for a populist politician. And it sounds like with the Queen Victoria example that actually people were quite consciously adopting that template. I wonder if there are other examples where future populists look back to Napoleon and learnt from the template, from his copybook about how to do it.
I think, one example actually would come from his nephew, Napoleon III, who very deliberately copied some of his propaganda techniques. But one innovation that Napoleon III used, which has become part of the populist playbook, I think, Napoleon III, certainly in France, I don't know whether this is true elsewhere in the world, but certainly in France, was the first ruler who quite deliberately went on very stage-managed political tours through the countryside, where there were announcements in advance that the emperor would be passing through particular towns, often using the new railways that were crisscrossing the countryside, and almost anticipating modern politicians using those whistle-stop tours to make major announcements along the way, and to give dress rehearsed speeches along the way too. So I think there's a very interesting history of the way in which the populist playbook has been manufactured over the years.
There's a great question on the Q&A from Daisy Bailey, Peter, which is, could you talk a bit about the role of emotions and public feeling in populism and nationalism?
I think that's a wonderful, very difficult and very fascinating question, because I think one of the attributes of the successful populist politician, of course, as we know only too well in the times in which we've been living, is the capacity to play on people's emotions, to appeal to people's emotions, to assure them that there are simple solutions to complex problems. And one of the characteristics that we find most disconcerting about populism, of course, is that so often those simple solutions are at the expense of groups who are often in vulnerable positions. And I think one of the most troubling dimensions of the relationship between populist leaders and the emotions is the way in which they're able to actually appeal to very destructive emotions as well as to uplifting ones. It's one thing to talk about Napoleon's appeal to the patriotic virtues and to the legacy of the French Revolution. It's quite another to appeal to ethnic or racial stereotypes, of course.
There's a question, Peter, from Janet McCalman asking whether you'd consider de Gaulle as drawing upon the Napoleonic narrative or template.
Yes, and indeed, one of the things that was most controversial about that book by Lionel Jospin was that he regarded de Gaulle as being very much within the Bonapartist tradition. And it's true that de Gaulle has that sort of Janus-faced dimension to him, that after all, he's someone who had a truly heroic existence as a personification of French resistance during the Second World War, and who was profoundly committed to the ideals of French republicanism and French democracy. And yet here is someone who in 1958 is willing to actually overthrow the French Republic in order to institute a new constitution in which he will be the president. So Jospin saw the Gaullist legacy as very much trading on the Napoleonic one, even though he was very careful to say that there is nothing in de Gaulle's story which is remotely as destructive of human life as is the case with Napoleon, of course.
Alicia, have we got time for more questions, or do we need to move on?
You've got time for one more question.
You mentioned right at the start, Peter, that this is the 200th anniversary of of Napoleon's death. How did that work out in France itself? I mean, given the controversial nature of his character and the sort of the Janus-faced side of the populist as opposed to the hero. So how did France in 2021 deal with Napoleon's 200th anniversary?
Well, it was very controversial, and it actually connects back to one of our earlier seminars in this series, Al, because in France, just like in the United States and here and many other countries, there has been a Black Lives Matter movement. And one of the most uncomfortable dimensions of the Napoleonic legacy is that after the French Revolution in 1794 had abolished slavery in the French Caribbean colonies, Napoleon tried to reinstate it in 1802. And the independent nation of Haiti that we now know is the successful attempt of those freed slaves to fight off the invasion by Napoleonic troops and to become the first independent country in 1804. So when the formal speeches are being made at the great ceremony in Paris for the bicentenary of Napoleon's death, certainly there are some people who make the traditional speeches of celebration of his greatness, of the Napoleonic vision for the French revolutionary legacy across Europe and all the rest of it. What President Emmanuel Macron felt that he needed to do, however, was to qualify that by talking about slavery and the legacy of slavery in France, and connecting it to the anger of people from France's former African and Caribbean colonies. That caused a storm of outrage among the great mass of French people, for whom Napoleon is the greatest French person who ever lived. And so, in fact, it was a very fraught moment when Macron really was caught between the need to recognise the Napoleonic legacy and his popularity, but at the same time to recognise the realities of French public life today.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, back to you, Alicia.
Thank you, Al, and thanks so much, Peter. And I'll invite our next speaker, Jon, to come on. We can see Jon's screen, but not Jon just yet. Jon Piccini is lecturer in history at Australian Catholic University. He researches Australian history from a global perspective, and his most recent book is Human Rights in 20th Century Australia. And Jon will speak to us tonight about the mainstream origins of populism. Welcome, Jon.
Thanks, Alicia and Al for inviting me to this event. It's really great to be able to talk to you all tonight, and commiserations to the many Melburnians or Victorians amongst yourselves, of course. I'd also like to acknowledge that I am coming to you tonight from the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples in Brisbane or Meanjin, to acknowledge that land is sovereign and has never been ceded, and to also acknowledge elders past and present. So, populism. This is an idea that's having another moment in the sun, we might say. The last decade has seen a rise of a new crop of leaders on the left and the right, whose appeal to base sentiments and loose promises earned them this, I think, clearly disparaging title. An academic subdiscipline has kind of sprung up to analyze this phenomenon, and global philanthropists like Tony Blair have turned their minds to its eradication. Now, we all know a populist when we see one. They have shady pasts. Think about Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who killed communists in the 1970s, or any other dissident he could get his hands on. And Donald Trump, of course, was Donald Trump. Don't need to say too much more there. They all appeal to an imagined people whose rights have been trampled by elites, and they favor strong borders to keep dangerous cosmopolitans at bay, to make their nations great again, economically. But historians are an annoying lot. We, rather than just accept this new term, theorize it and deploy it, we tend to contextualize and to criticize. Why are we suddenly hearing this term all of a sudden? And what work is it doing? I proffer here that the term populism has re-emerged as the most recent phrase for a longer trend in politics, a kind of isolationist mentality which fears the ramifications of international influence. And far from an outlier, such an approach has often been a mainstream one. So I want to particularly to explore this mentality in relation to my recently published work on human rights that Alicia has already cited. Legal scholars have diagnosed an Australian outlook which views international law as un-Australian, fanciful, and chaotic. Wendy Brown, in her 2007 book, Walled States Waning Sovereignty, sees such thinking as epitomizing the contradictions of a globalized world, where trade and people move relatively freely, at least until recently, within a broader framework of increasingly militarized national borders and a populist sentiment increasingly opposed to outside influences. So the term populism enters the historical record, which is of course now defined by the Trove database of the National Library of Australia, really in the 1890s, naming a movement of rural workers in the United States who were campaigning against the plutocratic, as they called it, Republican and Democratic parties of the Gilded Age. Now, Australians seem to have been enamored of this movement, at least accounting to the amount of articles that were written about it. And indeed, our own ALP bears some striking similarity, posing as the only national party against foreign interests and so-called fat man, or the capitalist class. So it was Labour who led Australia's well-known work establishing the rules of post-war international order in the 1940s. Herbert v. Evatt was a hero of the smaller nations, as they were put at the time, at the nascent UN, delivering greater powers to the General Assembly and arguing for stronger social and economic protections in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, on the drafting committee of which Australia sat. But even at this high point of Australian internationalism, Evatt was cautious not to betray his party's arguably populist roots. Evatt played no small part in securing protections for domestic jurisdiction, as it was put, built into the UN Charter, meaning that, quote, as he put it on his return, international matters such as migration policies of a state will not fall within the scope of the organisation. Labour's cherished White Australia policy was protected, and Evatt returned declaring that human rights were synonymous with the colloquial fair go. Now, Percy Spender, who would go on to replace Evatt in the External Affairs portfolio in 1949, thought that even this display of careful diplomacy went too far, claiming Evatt was, quote, so carried away by internationalism that he could no longer serve Australian interests. This set the tone for much of the decades to come, as the long conservative governments of Rob Menzies and his successors saw little value in what they called in one document emotional human rights discussions, particularly as the era of decolonisation unfolded, as these came to focus primarily on race, an issue that Australia did not much like to talk about. I'll go back a bit. Leaving now Australia's early and vital engagement with human rights, for the rest of the time, I want to shift our lens to a later period, the 1980s and the 1990s. It was here that Australian governments began getting serious about human rights. Key conventions, namely here the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, were ratified under the Fraser government. The first human rights commissions were established, and international law finally began to have concrete impacts on Australian domestic legislation. And this is, of course, thanks largely to the Tasmanian Dams case of 1983. It's also in this era that the rhetoric of populism begins to enter the Australian politics, at least at the elite level. The earliest reference I could find, admittedly I wasn't exhaustive in this, but I found John Howard labeling Bob Hawke a populist as early as 1984. I venture that these moves towards the recognition of international law and human rights sparked a populist wave of anti-rights activism with strong resonances to today's movements. So in 1985, as part of moves to establish a permanent human rights commission in Canberra, Australia entered one of our now semi-regular attempts to pass a Bill of Rights. Now, these are a mainstay of Western governments today in the contemporary period, but in Australia, we've never gotten around to, or never had the consensus to get one through. So while the Fraser government had actually led the way on human rights earlier in the decade, the ascension of the new right, it was somewhat epitomized by John Howard, marked a drastic change in thinking amongst conservatives. Groups like the Institute for Public Affairs led this wave of what we might now call neoliberal thinking and responded to calls for legislated rights as one might expect, calling them, quote, code words designed to promote values, ideologies, and lifestyles that are unacceptable to the vast majority of Australians. John Spender, the opposition spokesman on legal affairs, called this an exercise in social engineering, which could see a shift in the whole balance of power between the federal government and the states. Then opposition leader John Howard, for his part, added the Human Rights Commission to a list of offices he wished to abolish if his party would have an office. Now, the Bill of Rights died an inglorious death in this era, but its spectre lingered over debates sparked by the successful complaint of one Nicholas Toonen to the United Nations Human Rights Committee in December of 1992. Now, he successfully argued that anti-sodomy laws on the books in Tasmania violated the right to privacy under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 26, I believe. While the committee could only suggest how Australia might respond, the then Keating government rushed through Parliament the Human Rights Sexual Conduct Bill 1994, which for the first time utilised the External Affairs power to introduce human rights language into Australian law. The flow of anti-rights rhetoric became a torrent after this. Critics dubbed the UN's decision the work of faceless international bureaucrats who wish to control Australia from afar. Liberal leadership aspirant Peter Reith favoured states' rights over gay rights. as one headline put it. Others argue that it was a de facto Bill of Rights, a tyranny of the majority. And this is a quote from one protest letter, a tyranny of the community by a mischievous minority, in so being an attack on democracy itself. So thus far, our story has been one of Labor governments making positive change and Conservative opposition resisting tooth and claw. Now, a year after the events of Tunen, another case saw some unity on this question of right, or at least their lack of applicability in Australia. In Teo v Commonwealth, a Malaysian resident of Australia appealed to the High Court against his deportation on character grounds. A majority of the justices in the High Court at that time agreed that the decision to deport him had been made without due diligence of potential rights violations, particularly concerning the man's children. Now, this was despite the argument that he had offered, his legal argument, had not made any reference to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is a central part of this problem that Labor had with this. Now, Labor's Gareth Evans, of course, a kind of human rights hero, and Michael Lavache, who was the Attorney General at the time, issued a statement in May 1995 affirming that, quote, entering into an international treaty did not mean that government decision makers will act in accordance with the treaty. Why would they? If the relevant provisions of the treaty had not been enacted into domestic Australian law. Now, this is standard, of course, when you ratify an international treaty, you're supposed to ensure that your laws are in compliance with it. But in this instance, Australia does not really tend to domesticate what they call domesticate international law or human rights treaties. So while Labor had welcomed the UN's decision on Tasmania, and the idea that international law could create new rights was another thing entirely. Much like Abbott in the 1940s, Keating wanted to ensure that migration policies remained a matter of domestic jurisdiction. So I hope my comments tonight help to place the contemporary populist moment in a bit of context. Whether we're talking about Tony Abbott's 2015 comments that Australians are sick of being lectured to by the United Nations, Scott Morrison's more recent statements regarding negative globalism, or nationalist tub thumping regarding climate negotiations, this is part of a broader fear of international law and human rights and a desire to erect boundaries around the nation to guarantee sovereignty. Such rhetoric is, of course, straight out of the populist playbook. Another question we might ask is, what does this term give us then that others don't? Thanks.
Thank you, John. Thanks for bringing us into Australia.
Sorry, it was a sudden shock, wasn't it?
Right there.
France into the 1990s Australia.
We leapt there. And over to Al for the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Alicia, and thanks very much, John. Just to encourage participants, if you've got any questions you want to ask to John, just put them in the Q&A and I'll deliver them to him. Just while people are thinking, John, I'm just trying to get my head around the connections that you were making between, on the one hand, populist politics, and the other hand, the politics of human rights. And I think what I was getting was that a sort of a populist critique of a range of human rights politics and discourses was arguing that it was elitist, that it was internationalist, that it was anti-Australian. Is that, can you say a bit more about how you, if you like, put on the one hand the discourses of populism and the politics of populism, how you connect that to human rights politics?
Thanks, Al. I mean, I guess what I was trying to say here is that populism tends to be about erecting boundaries around the nation and articulating a sense of what it is to be, an Australian. The term un-Australian was also coined in this period to, I think, describe sort of this kind of international sentiment. I mean, I guess my broader point is that, human rights are, especially in a country like Australia, seem to be seen as a foreign threat. And they have been, I think, because we have a domestic legal context, which is very framed by the common law, and we're the nation that most strongly stands by that tradition in terms of rights. And Britain has a Human Rights Act, for example, but we don't. We obviously are both common law jurisdictions. And also, I think that if we look at the history of Australia's approach to human rights, we can track through it a real sense in which, even from the Labor side, in which, yes, we want to engage with international institutions on the Labor side, but we don't want them to be able to dictate how our society is run, in effect. That, that there's this idea that human rights much like the kind of activist judiciary, which was also a big kind of bugbear of the Conservatives at this time, were a threat to proper Australian values, and that they were an attempt by various special interest groups, another term that's emerging at this time, to undermine the majority, to undermine majority rule effectively. So I think that's kind of what this is. It was part of a broader sort of critique of the rise of kind of minority or identity politics groups, you might say. So I think it's all kind of wrapped up in this sort of mess of the rise of neoconservatism and neoliberalism in the 70s and 80s. I don't know if that complicates or makes it even.
No, thanks, John. That's great. Tell me, right at the start, you showed that extraordinary graph, the wonderful thing you can do with Google, where you show the uses
I should have explained that.
Of words like populism. And there's a bit of a blip in the 1890s, and then it runs pretty low and steady. Then it begins to pick up in the 60s, and then it shoots upwards in 2010. And I guess what happens? What are the key things that happen around 2010 that makes the word, and presumably therefore the practice of populism, suddenly so much more at the front of people's attention?
That's a really good question. I mean, I'm not a populism scholar, but including great people at ACU like Ben Moffat, who people should look up if they want to learn more about the ins and outs of populism proper. I'm a foreigner in this terrain, but I think it has a lot to do with the 2008 financial crisis. I think we need to look at the rise of populism in the context of the financial crisis that destabilized the world. It threw doubt on the international economy. It threw doubt on international organizations. It turned those international organizations, primarily the European Union here, from a body that was primarily about unity to one that was about discipline and austerity. And I think it has had a real effect on closing minds and closing borders since then, since the global financial crisis. And that would be one reason why I think that this term populism has emerged, but also I just think that we've got different terms that we use over time. Like, I think we might have called those people something different in the past, but we've jumped on this term populism recently. So my question is, I guess, what does the term populism give us that we don't get from other terms? I'm not sure.
Okay, thanks, John. There's a question from David Lowe. You make a case for linking modern populism to anti-internationalism. Is that a fair reading of your interpretation? And if so, just how crucial is the anti-internationalism?
That's a good question, David. Thanks. I mean, there's a lot that goes into populism, isn't there? I mean, there's the anti-internationalism side, but there's also these aspects around opposition to elites who tend to be international. So there are national elites who they're opposed to, but it's usually wrapped up in some sort of nefarious concept of the United Nations or the World Health Organization or someone doing something awful. So I think, we've got the elite anti-elitism. It's often tied in with a sort of strange popular economic policy as well, which tends to oppose international banking, which then also has a often has a quite anti-Semitic tinge to it as well. So I think if you look at all the aspects of that we kind of usually associate with populism, there's usually an international component that goes into this. And I mean, I think, David, it would be interesting to look into the history of anti-internationalism as much as it would be as we do to chronicle the rise of internationalism. And I think we should probably look into that. I think it could be very helpful to look into that in our contemporary moment.
Thanks, John. There's a question from Daisy Bailey. You talked about how human rights discussions were dismissed as emotional when they shifted to a focus on race. Was this because was this because of the type of protest that people were engaging in?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the interesting thing about that whole period is, that Australia participates quite strongly in the 1940s in putting human rights together in a way, and then promptly withdraws with Spender and Menzies at the helm and really kind of pulls back on engagement. This does have a lot to do with, I think, the rising decolonization movement all over the world, whereby Australia is no longer facing a world of empire, but we're facing a world of increasingly sovereign and militantly anti-racist nations. And on the other hand, yeah, it is about protest as well. I think that particularly when Australia sees a threat of a domestic group like Indigenous Australians trying to connect their struggle to the United Nations or to African nations or to the Black Power movement in America, that's where you really get a lot of fear coming out. That's where we really get that's where the fear really gets into them, where you get ASIO issuing lists of African Americans not to allow into the country and whatnot, so that they can keep a lid on it all. So yeah, it's definitely connected up, and the emotional aspect of this is interesting as well, because obviously then we can have a fairly gendered reading of this as well, where we can say that obviously the Australian government is saying that there's this kind of emotional, not proper human rights kind of stuff over there about race and colonialism and whatnot, and then there's I imagine then the practical, or they don't make this clear, the practical civil liberties, democracy stuff that Australia prides itself on and presents itself as a leader on, of course, in the world.
Okay, thanks, John. Back to you, Alicia.
Thanks, Al. And thank you, John. And now I'm going to invite our third speaker, Dr. Imogen Saunders. Imogen is an associate professor at the ANU College of Law. She researches international law, including its history, and is going to reflect on the increased backlash against international law in the face of the pandemic. Thank you, Imogen.
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you very much for having me here. I'd like to start by acknowledging the land that I'm coming to you from. I'm coming from Canberra, which is the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, to acknowledge this land, that sovereignty was never ceded, and to respect and pay my respects to elders past and present. I was going to start by saying, as Alicia has indicated, that I'm a bit of an outlier tonight. I'm not a historian, I'm an international lawyer. But I'm actually delighted to say that what I'm going to be talking about has links to both Peter's presentation, in particular his concluding remarks in terms of the tendencies of Napoleon that might be considered populist, and some very clear, as you'll see, links to John's presentation. So I'm going to be talking about populism, international law, and the current pandemic, but I'm going to start by taking you back to the Charter of the United Nations, which was signed on 26th of June, 1945. And I just want to read 3 bits from its preamble. So the UN Charter was, in the preamble, states, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained. Now, the reason I read this is the context of the UN Charter was very much written in the failure of the League of Nations before it. And the League of Nations itself arose out of the ashes of World War I, out of the rise of right-wing nationalist and could be described as populist governments pre-World War I. And again, the same thing that happened pre-World War II. And I just, at this point, want to engage with that last question that John was asked about this movement for anti-internationalism, because I think what's really interesting is what I'm going to be talking about in terms of backlash against international law. A lot of those actions actually have direct parallels to what the US was doing, both in the years of the League of Nations, but also in the immediate post-World War II period, where the US was not engaging with international institutions, refusing to join the League of Nations, refusing to join the Permanent Court of Arbitration, refusing to ratify the International Trade Organization statute so that that organization failed. So in a way, none of this is new. But what I think is striking at the moment is the UN Charter came about when the world saw a need for a global solution to a global problem. We fast forward 75 years and we're facing another global problem, which is the pandemic. And I'm just going to borrow a little bit from an article written by myself and some colleagues and read it. The word pandemic derives from the Greek pan, or, and demos, people. A pandemic is thus an epidemic of an infectious agent that is spread across a population, crossing national boundaries and affecting large numbers of people worldwide. Arguably, the most striking feature of the current pandemic is its global reach and effects. There is no single territory or human community that is unaffected by or invulnerable to the spread of the COVID-19 respiratory disease. And indeed, even the last standout, Antarctica, had a confirmed case of COVID on it last year. So given the global reach and effects of this pandemic, it would seem that international law, the very modern architecture of which was set up to deal with global problems, would be the place to turn to find solutions. But this hasn't been the case. And why not? Well, I argue it's because the pandemic happened in the context of this other phenomenon, which is populist backlash against international law. Now, as has been alluded to tonight, the concept of populism itself is contested. There are very many different definitions of populism, and indeed, even the term, as Jon has said, might just be describing an older phenomenon that we've had already. But for the purposes of my presentation, I think there are two key factors of populism that we can draw out to analyse the response to the pandemic with. The first is this idea of anti-elitism, and the second is the idea of exclusion and othering. And I'm going to talk about each in turn. So for anti-elitism, in the context of international law and the pandemic, it has two expressions, both of which are related. Now, the first is the characterization of institutions, and in particular international institutions, as inherently elite and out of touch with the people. And so a populist response is rejection of those international institutions. And we've seen this pre-pandemic with, for example, the withdrawal of the US from the Paris Agreement under then President Trump. In the context of the pandemic, we saw it with the rejection of the World Health Organization, again by then President Trump. But more than that, we saw a rejection of expert evidence and scientific elite. And so various populist leaders, Trump minimised the COVID-19 threat. Bolsonaro, despite contracting COVID-19, described it as no more dangerous than a little flu. Lukashenko, the Belarusian president, described the virus as a psychosis. And over the past few days, it's come to light that allegations of Boris Johnson, before becoming critically ill with COVID, thought that it was so not dangerous that he offered to inject himself with COVID live on national TV. So there is this common thread running through populist leaders that international advice and international scientific advice is rejected. Even those countries which were initially praised for their response, such as India, we can see where choices then to ignore social distancing recommendations, as happened with the holding of very large rallies by President Modi and his party, has been linked directly to the disastrous second wave now in the country. Now, while this rejection of scientific evidence has devastating results domestically, it also makes international cooperation very difficult. Because if leaders are not agreeing on the base level of the threat or the fundamental seriousness of the pandemic, then any meaningful interaction or international interaction or any meaningful international cooperation seems very unlikely. So that's the first side, is rejection of international institutions. The second side, and it's tied to the anti-elitism, is the primacy and elevation of primary producers. So this view of populism elevates workers who are seen as making a direct and primary contribution to the economy. They are seen as the opposite of the out-of-touch global elite. And again, you can see this pre-pandemic in terms of the rejection of free trade as the tool of the greedy globalist, which hurts the real workers, and in particular in Trump's America, the steel workers. I've got a quote from Trump, which being a quote from Trump is a little hard to read, but I'll do my best. Our workers' loyalty was repaid, you know it better than anybody, with total betrayal. Our politicians have aggressively pursued a policy of globalisation, moving our jobs, our wealth and our factories to Mexico and overseas. Globalisation has made the financial elite who donate to politicians very, very wealthy. So again, you see that distancing of the elite by the populist leader. Now, in the pandemic, the way this manifested most crucially was the prioritisation of the economy above all. And we saw this even here in Australia last year during lockdown. The rhetoric that what was being lost by shutting down was much worse than what was being saved, and that we should open up the economy, even if it meant that some of the more vulnerable, in this case the elderly, might have to bear the cost. This was surely better than the economic woes we're facing by shutdown. Now, ultimately, as we all know, this narrative was resisted in Australia, but premature reopenings in countries such as the US have been linked to spread of the disease. Now, bringing this back to the international law perspective, there's two problems with this anti-elitism / prioritisation of the economy aspects of populism. The first is a human rights critique. And so returning to the UN Charter, the Charter reaffirms the fundamental human rights and the dignity and worth of every human person. But what we saw in the context of the pandemic was very different. Instead, the workers we suddenly deemed the most essential, the workers that had to keep working, were revealed to be the ones treated by society as the most disposable. The essential industries, those primarily service and care work, are those disproportionately staffed by minorities and by women. They often have very little job security. They are a class of workers vulnerable to exploitation. And in the height of the pandemic in many countries, were also those unable to access personal protective equipment. So far from protecting human rights, the responses to the pandemic exposed an already vulnerable group of workers to the most level of danger from it. The second problem with this response is in the field of international trade. Now, there is a long history of a link between nationalism and inward-facing sovereignty and international trade. Indeed, the modern international trade system was built on the increase in incredibly protectionist tariffs both before World War I and World War II. And free trade has seen, or has been seen in the past 50 years as vital for increased political cooperation. However, the shock to global supply chains in the pandemic has seen a response that turns inwards once more. When global personal protective equipment shortages hit, many countries, including Australia, talked about bringing manufacturing back onshore. Depending on how this is done, that could be in breach of Australia's World Trade Organization obligations. We're now seeing the blocking of exports, not just exports of vaccines, but of materials needed to create vaccines. And last year there were blocking of PPE exports as well. So rather than relying on a robust international trade system to keep supplies flowing, national leaders have tended to raise trade barriers instead. And that brings me to my second major point, and one that ties in with Jon's presentation, is this other characterization of populism about exclusion and other. Because othering in populism is about setting something, usually outside your national borders, as something that needs to be protected against. And we've seen this with the chants of build the wall, Trump rallies. We've seen it in the entire rhetoric behind Britain's self-exclusion through Brexit. And we've seen it in Australia's own refugee policies. Now, when the pandemic hit, what we saw was quickly language being deployed to describe this disease as other. It was called the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, the Kung flu by Donald Trump. But just as borders have been used to keep visible aliens, i.e. non-nationals, out, national borders were quickly raised to keep the now invisible alien, that is the pandemic out. It's interesting because border control is actually explicitly not a recommendation of the World Health Organization's international health regulations. And I'll just take a minute to give a little bit of context there. The new international health regulations were written after SARS epidemic, which was described as the first post-Westphalian disease. And it envisioned a world in which the nation state had become less dominant. The international cooperation was the main discourse. However, I suggest that COVID is actually the first post-Westphalian disease, and it's coming at a time where states are turning inwards again. And national borders are very interesting because there's no argument that they've been successful in some circumstances, Australia being one, New Zealand being one, but they haven't been in other cases. And the distinction here is that countries' populist leaders are generally speaking not willing to accept restrictions on their own freedoms. And so national borders are accepted because they exclude others, but any kind of internal protection measure which requires restrictions on individual freedoms is rejected. And it leads to this tension between what we previously described as the right to protect, but the freedom to infect. That we're quite happy to exclude others from our country, but we're not going to bear any kind of internal restrictions on our rights. So time to sum up. My question is, where to now? It's clear that the ongoing populist backlash has impacted on international law's ability to respond to COVID-19. It's been suggested that the devastation caused in populist countries might lead to the downfall of populist leaders, but there are still many populist leaders in power in the world today. If populism is an ongoing phenomenon, it's something that's going to need to be dealt with in terms of how international institutions and international law can continue functioning. And I suggest that's particularly important, not just in the context of the current pandemic, but in the current context of future global problems that we're going to have to face, and in particular, the consequences of climate change. So that's where I'll leave that presentation.
Thanks so much, Imogen. That was a fascinating final talk, and I will pass over to Al for the Q&A.
There was so much in that. I'm just trying to work my head through it, Imogen, but just your final point, which is just intriguing, which is the issue about actually the ways in which populist politics and leaders are undermining the sort of efficacy of international institutions and international cooperation and human rights legislation, etc. And you talked about, well, it's raising an issue about how international institutions and internationalists might deal with populist leaders. And I guess I'm curious, what are the ways in which international organisations could do, given that, yeah, the way national politics works, what are the ways in which internationalists and international institutions could be deployed or could act in any way against populist leadership and leaders?
It's a really good question, and I'm going to have to say I don't have the answer to it. You know, it's one of those things that's doing the rounds in international law at the moment. Every international law conference is reimagining the future or reshaping the future of international law, because in a lot of ways we feel that there is this watershed moment, that the way that international institutions, the assumption that international institutions were built on might not ring true anymore. And if that's the case, how do we go forwards? Now, to give you an example of what could happen, it's a trade law specific example, but the World Trade Organization has a dispute settlement system that has been crippled over the past 4 years by the US. So the US has blocked appointments to the appellate body such that the appellate body can no longer function, which means the entire dispute system can no longer function. So it's essentially destroyed an international court acting unilaterally. What other countries have done is they've gone outside the system. And so the EU has set up this alternate means of arbitration for countries to take their disputes. And so in a way, it's trying to remove the problem from the system. But of course, that's only going to work for so long, especially when the country that is taking the action is one of the big powers in the world. So I think my answer is, but there seems to be in some cases just wait it out, basically. Wait for the populist leaders to lose, for their populations to get sick of them. But as I said, I'm not sure how reasonable that is. And so it might be that there needs to be some kind of reckoning in terms of how these institutions work.
Once again, just invite participants to put any questions into the Q&A. I guess one thing that strikes me is that both World War I with the League of Nations and World War II with the United Nations, global crises which proved the disastrous effects of different forms of nationalism led to these internationalist movements with more or less success. And you could argue that there are ways in which this pandemic has some parallels with the World War, just in terms of the scale of the catastrophe, the international effects of the catastrophe, and so on. And, is there a way of looking for a silver lining and thinking that actually the nature of the pandemic and its catastrophic effects and the ways in which, anti-elitism, anti-internationalism, et cetera, has been profoundly damaging, that it might actually move us in that international direction again? Is there any reason for hope?
Yeah, I think that's I think it's a really nice way of thinking about it. I think the reality is, of course, we've had 76 years in the UN period. That's unprecedented in terms of international cooperation, and the League of Nations only lasted for 20 odd years and was essentially crippled for the last 8 of them. So it's been a very long time for these institutions to operate without some kind of reimagining or reform or renewal. And so, one suggestion is this is just a moment to actually do that, to work out what is working and what's not, and to realign them with the realities that we need going forward. So I think that's certainly possible. The other way of thinking about it is that maybe we're not really seeing a backlash at all. And I didn't get into what backlash means and how it's been discussed. But, there always have been these tides of internationalism. And I think that came through with Jon's presentation too. There have been times when countries are more willing to look outwards and times to the global, and times when countries are more willing to look inwards. And so maybe what we're seeing right now isn't really a backlash, it's just a retreat from what was sort of the high watermark of the internationalisation in the 1990s. And maybe this is inevitable. It's just coincided with a pandemic, but it will come back again. And this is just something that happens through time, that countries will reach out and then retreat back.
There's a couple of questions here that are probably for the whole panel. So, but maybe I'll ask, this is from Rosa Matarana, who asks, how do populist leaders and regimes convince people who they clearly think are expendable? How do they convince those people to support them and to vote for them? I guess that's a key question.
Well, I think what's interesting, I guess there's 2 things, is that the populist leaders don't make that clear in their initial elections. So it's not as if, generally speaking, a populist leader will say to the general population that I'm going to sacrifice you. But I think what happens is when this does happen, and you've seen this in the pandemic, that you see the devastating consequences of a gutted healthcare system and a lack of protection and the incredibly high death rates in certain countries, that those populist leaders do lose their support pretty quickly. And so that's why I said at the end, it's been suggested by some people that the inability of populist leaders to cope with the pandemic might actually be their downfall, that the populists will finally see that they're not being protected.
Thanks, Imogen. It is nice to get a slightly optimistic end point there, that actually it might be their downfall. I'm going to pass back to Alicia now and Susie, who's going to open up the panel to a wider Q&A.
Thank you, Al. And Imogen, we're rapt to have you. Don't worry. We think very important to have not only historians coming and speaking to us at Making Public Histories. So I'm going to invite our speakers to all show their video again, as well as Susie Prochke, who's going to lead us through our final Q&A, which is probably about 15 or so minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Alicia, and thanks everyone. Just while we're waiting for more members of the audience to use the Q&A and ask questions, I will open out that last question that Rosa and I asked to the whole panel. So I'll read it again. I'll read my version this time. How do populist regimes get away with making so many people expendable, from the hundreds of thousands whom Napoleon managed to sacrifice, to current governments that have decided some internationally focused sectors, looking at universities, are expendable? And, I guess, Imogen, you suggested that, perhaps it's not sustainable, but if you flip that, couldn't you sort of say, if you were more cynical, people get the governments they voted for? I don't know. So I'll open it out to maybe Peter and Jon can have a first go at that question. And
I think it's really interesting question. I guess the most depressing thing for me about the last 15 months has been to realise that in most parts of the world, people have been prepared to accept extraordinary levels of infection and even death as almost the price that has to be paid for living through this. I think we've been in a very odd situation in Australia because that rhetoric hasn't really gripped. But when you look at the Northern Hemisphere, I mean, the thing that strikes me about Europe, for example, is just the extent to which people have accepted extraordinary rates of infection and death. I think that there are some really interesting questions that run through these papers about the relationship between emotion and populism, about the nature of emotional appeals at times of crisis. Yeah, I'd love to agree with Imogen about the death knell of populism being sounded, but after all, Donald Trump's probably the only populist leader who we might look at and say, well, I think your failure to deal with COVID probably had a major influence on your downfall. That if you look at other populist leaders around the world, from Modi and Duterte to Lukashenko, even Boris Bolsonaro, they're still there. And where they've exposed their weakness, of course, is that they've tried to, through their populism, they've tried to be in charge of responses to the crisis, and they've failed again and again and again. They haven't had the chief health officers standing next to them on the podium. They've actually tried to control a populist response to this virus with disastrous effects. But at the moment, there's only been one major casualty among the populist ranks, hasn't there?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. Thanks, Peter and Imogen, for those comments already. I mean, I think I agree with Imogen in terms of, populist leaders tend to fail when they can't deliver on their promises. And in a way, they're kind of across purposes anyway. They get elected using what they consider to be a corrupt political system. And then they become complicit in it. And they have to make compromises, and they alienate their supporters, and they end up in a kind of nice French Revolution sense, kind of eating their own children. They end up attacking each other and falling apart. Thinking here particularly, of course, of the example of the first go of the One Nation Party in Australia. But I mean, as well, I'm interested in this concept of expendability. I mean, are we saying here that only populist leaders view their people as expendable? I think that this would be something it would be an incorrect thing to say, I think. I think, if anything, maybe populism comes out of emerges from an idea that the people are expendable by international organizations or by political leaders. If you go back to, I think the Iraq War probably has an awful lot to do with the rise of populism. I think, that they were willing to say, the US is willing to sacrifice, thousands of its own soldiers and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians, for a war that was fought for what precisely? You know, I think we need to be cautious, I think, in saying that if we do say, we might not be saying that populists view their people's lives as particularly expendable, because I think that might be something that we can see across the political spectrum.
Imogen, would you go on? Sorry.
No, sorry, Imogen wants to contribute. No.
I'm happy. I was going to say, look, I actually agree with Peter. I was trying to be optimistic, but I'm not sure it is going to be the downfall for the populist leaders. I think it will be only if it gets truly bad enough in their countries. But even then, I'm not convinced.
Shall I move on to the next question? We've got one from Janet McCalman about masculinity and populist leaders. She says, could I ask about toxic masculinity in male populist leaders, so that their bravado regarding COVID has been dysfunctional? And I guess I'll rephrase this as a question: does toxic masculinity play into deep emotional needs of people for strong male figures who will take responsibility for crises?
I think the implication of the list I had at the end of my presentation about the nature of the populist appeal, I think suggests that that comment of Janet's is very close to the mark, that most populist leaders are male, and again and again we see them appealing to a particular type of masculinity. And I think that that's what has actually led to the abject failure of many of them to protect their populations. That they've tried to assume that they can work their way through this with bravado. I mean, as Imogen pointed out, the thought that Boris's first response to all of this was to say, look, I'll be injected with the virus in public. I mean, how much macho bravado do you want? So I think, I think there's a very salient point in what Janet's saying.
Can I just add to that? I think there's a really clear link between this sort of very performative masculinity and rejection of mask wearing and social distancing as being seen as weak. So, the idea that real men don't wear masks, real men don't have to use hand sanitizer or keep their distance. Lukashenko making comments like, you just need to get out to the fields and drive a tractor. You don't need to do any of this, feminized stuff like actually listening to science. So I think there was a real gendered response to COVID. And I think it aligns very neatly with that populist response as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can only agree with what my co-panelists have commented here. I think that there is a need for some sort of powerful leader in these crisis times. Speaking of masculine populists, back to Bob Hawke, and maybe John Howard was sort of correct in some degree too. Obviously, using this as a political kind of throw around term, we wouldn't compare Bob Hawke to Donald Trump normally, but certainly Bob Hawke did express obviously a great degree of masculine bravado. And also, yeah, it makes me think about, what of those few political populist groups who do have female leaders, like Marine Le Pen, of course, in France, and also Pauline Hanson, who have already thrown into the mix, unfortunately. But I think they do something for the male voters as well, particularly for male voters. It's male voters who overwhelmingly vote for these parties. So obviously there's something about like a strong woman who's also anti-political correctness, who seems to like agree with them on everything. There's obviously something going on there as well.
Yeah, I mean, the program as well is highly gendered.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
In Australia, we have policies that are encouraging tacitly or more explicitly, male breadwinners getting welfare, women before the recent budget, women sort of returning to the home to look after children.
Yeah, I mean, One Nation has like very sexist policies, of course, abolition of the family court, basically just saying rape is okay, like all this stuff, they're really awful, but, it's coming from this female leader. So I wonder what kind of work that does.
Susie, can I raise something that I think cuts across all of this, and it was one of the points that Imogen was getting at, and that is the nature of the emotional appeals that we've seen to identity and belonging. I kept thinking during the presentations, you know, one of the most famous works of history and anthropology that's been written in the last 50 years was by Benedict Anderson, the famous Imagined Communities, where he was looking back at where this extraordinary thing called nationalism came from. And he, of course, went back to the French Revolution and appeals to imaginary communities of people who would never meet each other, often didn't speak the same language, and yet felt that they were somehow part of a community. And one of the things that's hit me most, and I think Imogen was getting at this as well, was just how strong the appeal has been over the last 15 months, not only to nation, but to smaller entities like states. I mean, who would have thought at the start of last year that a state like Victoria would be so polarised around the figure of a state response to an illness and to Daniel Andrews? I mean, what was going on in social media, you know, the I stand with Dan and I don't stand with Dan stuff was quite extraordinary and sort of inconceivable a couple of years ago, that people would be so passionate about Melbourne or Victoria. And of course, there have been appeals to Australia as well. And it reflects about what Imogen was saying about the decline, on the other hand, of internationalism and why that might have happened. But I think one of the most striking things for me over the last 15 months has been the strength of appeals to community, and often to communities that we thought were not so important anymore, like a state in Australia.
Can I just add on to that? Because I think there's this really fascinating thing that's happening. And I absolutely completely agree, Peter, that you've sort of got this drawing in to smaller communities and fencing off even. But at the same time, you have this transnational discourse of human rights that is happening. And so, you know, you have Karen from Bunnings citing incorrectly the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but then you have Australian citizens citing the US Constitution and rights contained in that in protests. So at the one hand, you have communities getting smaller and identifying as that. But on the other hand, because this is happening to everyone at the same time, there is this discourse that's going on about rights that is really bleeding over national boundaries, which I think is just fascinating.
I've actually got a question specifically about Europe here that I think speaks to that, Imogen. Could Europeans, for example, consider their culture and way of life as a question of identity, which for them is more important sometimes than life or health? So going back to Peter's observation that so many Europeans have been willing to sacrifice people in order to sort of stay open.
Yes, I think that's a very acute question. I mean, we're on a knife edge right now in Europe, aren't we? Where, as it was the case last year, there've been very deliberate decisions now that the case numbers are coming down to open the borders, to open for summer. That there's a whole way of life that is the European summer that needs to be protected. But yes, I think the question's also looking at instances in the past where populist leaders have made very emotional appeals to national or cultural or ethnic identity as a way of defending people against the other. You know, the history of Europe is littered with tragedy in that regard.
Carolyn Holbrook wants to know, should historians become psychologists? Would historians benefit from a rigorous framework of human psychology to enhance our analyses?
I certainly think that the work that's been so popular and so important in the historical discipline over the past 15 years, which has been the history of emotions, I think one of the challenges for historians is actually engaging very deliberately with some other disciplines. And I think psychology is one, I think neuroscience is another, that I think that we're increasingly aware of the importance of the study of emotions in making sense of the past and of the present. And I think there are whole new areas of interdisciplinary scholarship to open up in this regard.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. I think that's really an interesting point. I mean, the question that I have is sort of, where do we find psychology in the archive? And, you know, like, there's been every book under the sun written about Hitler's different psychological motivations, and often I think that kind of ends up shading into popular readings, I think. And I think that's quite difficult. I mean, this made me think of Barbara Keyes has got some really interesting work on at the interface of political history and psychology recently, looking at the case study of Henry Kissinger, of course, is, you know, very who is a man who she finds to be entirely led really by his emotions and by his psychology in negotiations, to the point of kind of viewing meetings of having favorable outcomes if he was served a sumptuous dinner by Zhao Enlai, you know, versus if he was, you know, just served a few crackers or something, you know. So I think it is very interesting if we can start to piece that all together. But the question is, yeah, where are the sources, I guess, of that?
And wouldn't we end up with getting back to the great men in history?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's my Hitler comment. So yeah. I think we
weird men in history, maybe. I was going to say the not so great men of history as well. Well, that's all we have time for in our Q&A session tonight, and for Making Public History. So I want to thank Peter and Jon and Imogen for your generosity this evening and answering lots of different questions and connecting your stories together. And to our team behind the scenes, to Susie, Al and Margie. I'll just share my screen as well for the final thank yous. Also to our sponsor, Monash University Publishing, who kindly offer gifts to our speakers as a thank you. So we're very pleased to have them on board. And finally, I wanted to let you know about our next event, which is entitled Australia's Marine Environment, the History and Politics of Exploitation and Conservation. And so we're having a break next month in June, but this event will be on Thursday, the 22nd of July. And you'll hear from Lynette Russell, Alessandro Antonello and Joseph Christensen. You'll be able to book that one from tomorrow. And again, it will be on Zoom, so you can join us from anywhere. So finally, a last cheer for our three speakers. And thanks, of course, to all of you for your attendance, interest and participation, and good night.